Hello. I'm
The real story.
Happy June, everyone! It's good to be back, and it's good to be talking about The Man in Black. That's right, this time we're boarding a freight train from Jackson all the way down to San Antone, with a little stop at Immortality along the way, as we take a crack at our first musical biopic, Walk the Line. Based on his two autobiographies, 1975's Man in Black and 1997's Cash, the autobiography, this film tells the amazing life story of country music legend Johnny Cash, detailing his tragic early experiences as a boy in Arkansas, his unlikely but lightning-quick ascension to the top of the country music scene, the struggles with his anguish and addiction that would see him fall from those same heights, and the arc of redemption that brought him back to a place of personal satisfaction and peace. We're given detailed insights as to the inspirations behind many of his hit songs, his troubled relationships with his father and first wife, and many of the notable moments that would come to define what is one of the most untouchable legacies in music history and one of the coolest musicians of all time. At its heart, though, this is a telling of the classic test of time love story between Johnny and his second wife, country music star June Carter. It's a tale of seemingly star-crossed soulmates that defy the odds and find their destinies in one another, becoming one of the most legendary couples of all time. I adore this movie for so many reasons, and during my research I found even more reasons to appreciate this on an even greater level. While the performances and the music are obviously standout, there are several little nods to other things that, when you know the context behind them, add a nice new layer to many of these scenes. But just how close did they get to earning their stripes while telling this harrowing story? What did they get right? What did they get wrong? What did they leave out? And what happened after? Well, I've been everywhere, man, when it comes to researching this, so whether you got the Folsom Prison Blues or the Cocaine Blues, let's get a rhythm for 'em as we try to better understand the man come round. This is the real story behind Walk the Line. And if you don't want me to cry, make sure you hit the subscribe button and the like thing. Do all the things to all the buttons. Ain't no grave can hold this channel down, but the ring of fire that is YouTube's algorithm can. Okay, I promise, that's the last song reference we'll shoehorn in here. Thanks a bunch, let's get to it. Time's a-wasting. Fuck. So this movie really helped to popularize a certain style of telling of the music biopic that would be later adopted by others like Bohemian Rhapsody, Rocket Man, and of course the greatest one of all time, Walk Hard.
Mr. Cox? You're gonna have to give him a moment, son. Dewey Cox needs to think about his entire life before he plays.
We begin right before a seminal performance or moment that acts as a certain cornerstone of our subject's career that the rest of the movie frames around as we go back earlier in time. For our film, that moment is Johnny's 1968 performance at Folsom Prison. We'll come back to this when the movie does because it's not long before we are flashed back to childhood. If only it were that easy. Now is probably a good time to mention that I'll be covering the extended edition that was released on HBO Max in 2020. It includes 22 minutes of bonus footage, most of which is deleted scenes from the original DVD and extended musical numbers, but the scenes we get do have some nice Easter eggs that I will point out when we get to them. Johnny was born J.R. Cash on February 26, 1932 in Kingsland, Arkansas. He was the middle child of 7 that would be born to cotton farmers Ray and Carrie. The story goes that his parents could not settle on a name as his father wanted to name him Ray Jr., but his mother preferred the name John. So, JR was the only compromise that could be made. The Cash family would move to Dyess, Arkansas shortly after Johnny turned 3, and that's where we are when the flashback picks up a few years later in 1944. Dyess was the largest community building experiment in the country that was established as part of FDR's New Deal. See, farmers had done very well during World War I, however, had massively struggled during the Roaring Twenties, and so this program's goal was to give many of them who had gone destitute a chance at getting out of poverty and eventually owning their own land. For someone like Ray Cash, who had been serving in France during World War I and had missed that boom period, this was a chance at a fresh start. However, like all agrarian societies, life in Dias was extremely tough, as the young JR would quickly find out. Full of sun up to sundown, hard-working days in the field, all to barely get by without even having running water or electricity for several years. Families were expected to start making payments towards owning these farms after just 2 years, and the land Dias was chosen to be built on had been previously swampland that had to be drained and cultivated to later support the community. Because of this, it was prone to flooding, which was big problems for farmland and added even more to an already difficult existence. All that being said, it's easy to see why Ray Cash felt the need to escape into a bottle, as I'm sure it felt like life was against him at every turn. He was like most white southern farmers at the time, hard-working, angry, and seeing as Dias was a whites-only colony, unfortunately quite a bit racist. They drop a hard N-bomb early in the movie to illustrate this. His bitterness is played to perfection by the always fantastic Robert Patrick. We'll talk about Johnny's relationship with his father and that line a bit more later, but for now, let's talk a bit about his mother.
Maybe it's time for Reggie to talk about your mama a little bit.
She doesn't have a big presence in the movie outside of a few scenes and some offhanded remarks to allude to her encouraging of Johnny's interest in music, but her influence would have a profound impact on Johnny's future. Carrie Cash would be the one who originally helped Johnny to discover his love for music through her instillment of gospel music in the household at an early age, specifically Heavenly Highway hymnals, which we do see her give to him later. It's not really mentioned in the movie, but her influences would also inspire Johnny's older brother Roy to get into music, as he had a band called the Dixie Rhythm Ramblers, great name, and they had some minor success having their own Arkansas radio program for a time. Johnny's younger brother Tommy would also go on to become a pretty big country music star in his own right during the early 70s, touring with Hank Williams Jr. and having a top 5 hit called 6 White Horses. Pretty nice resume for Mama Cash, if you ask me. She's played by pop rock singer Shelby Lynn, which is one cool thing I wanted to point out is this movie's use of actual musicians for several of its roles. We also later see Tyler Hilton as Elvis, Waylon Payne as Jerry Lee Lewis, Jonathan Rice as Roy Orbison, and Shooter Jennings getting to play his father Waylon, which is always neat to see. Anyway, while JR might have been close with all of his siblings, it was his bond with his older brother Jack that was by far the strongest. We are shown an accurate depiction of this closeness as well as the dynamic of their relationship in the movie. It depicts Jack as the perfect child, always eager to help the family, with a hope to one day become a preacher to be able to touch as many lives as possible with the power of the Lord. And by all accounts, this appears to be accurate. Jack was only 2 years older than Johnny, but was already a deeply philosophical and spiritual thinker. And Johnny looked up to his older brother in every way. Jack's life, and probably even more so his death, deeply influenced many aspects of who his younger brother would go on to become as an adult, and this is captured in heartbreaking fashion in the movie. As we pointed out earlier, Jack worked to help to support his family in any way possible, and one Saturday afternoon, he had accepted a job cutting wood in the local high school's wood shop to earn a few extra dollars. Now, in the movie, Johnny is with him at one point while he is cutting the wood, and we get some foreshadowing of events to come as the machine misfires and Johnny is just able to power down the machine in the nick of time right before disaster. Jack then urges Johnny to go fishing and that everything will be fine, before soon everything is in fact not fine. Now, in reality, Johnny was not there that day at the woodshop with Jack at any point. He tells the story of that morning in his book, how he had begged and pleaded for Jack to go fishing with him instead of to work, and that everyone seemed to have an uneasy feeling about that day, including Jack himself. Johnny recalls him mentioning to his mother that he felt as though something bad might happen that day. However, he reconciled that they needed the money, and so he set off to get a full day's work in while Johnny went off fishing. I think they changed this in the movie to really drive home the guilt that Johnny felt about that day, even though he did not directly have any involvement by being or not being there. Now, as we know, these feelings the Cash family members were having would turn out to be prophetic after all, because while cutting wood, Jack would unfortunately suffer a horrific accident and was tragically pulled onto the table saw. The saw sliced deep into his midsection, nearly cutting him in two. And if that wasn't bad enough, to make matters worse, he exacerbated the problem by crawling across a dirty floor to reach help.
This was a particularly bad case of somebody being cut in half.
Speak English, Doc. We ain't scientists.
No, all kidding aside, this movie's version has Jack hang on for just a few hours before eventually succumbing to his injuries. The reality, though, however, is unfortunately a great deal more sad. Despite having no real chance of surviving, Jack actually lingered for about a week after the accident before finally, mercifully passing away.
Do something! Do something!
Up to this point, young JR had been a gregarious, happy-go-lucky boy who was full of jokes, but this deeply changed him into a very introspective and quiet individual, and he began to spend more time alone, writing stories and drawing sketches. Later, this deep-rooted sadness would, for better and for worse, become part of Johnny's sound as well, and you can hear the very real pain in a great multitude of his work. Jack's deathbed words would also have reverberating effects through the Cash family as well. The movie portrays this accurately as Jack asked his mother if she could hear the beautiful angels singing. These words would have long-lasting impact on Johnny, as it would be the inspiration for him to becoming a deeply devout Christian. From this moment on, his older brother would act as a spiritual guide from beyond the grave of sorts for Johnny, as any time he found himself in a tough spot, he would ask himself, WWJD, what would Jack do? But this is only part of Jack's purported final words, as Johnny would later tell that after asking about the angels, the dying Jack looked directly at his father and said, "Daddy, God is taking me, so you'll quit drinking." And I imagine this was the moment that anything that was left of Ray Cash's soul completely dissipated.
I wouldn't worry about him.
Here's where we get our first real extra scene from the extended edition in the form of Jack's funeral, but it is brief and ultimately doesn't amount to adding much to the movie aside from an especially dirty look given to the young JR by his father. I feel as though there was a much better opportunity for that extra scene here based off something that Johnny actually did that would have added a tremendous amount of depth to it. According to his sister Joanne, on the day of Jack's funeral, Johnny went to the graveside early, picked up a shovel, and began to help the workers to dig Jack's grave. At the service, his clothes were dirty from the effort, and he had worn no shoes since his foot was swollen from stepping on a nail. Can you imagine how powerful that would have been put to film? In either case, though, what we do get next is one of the most viscerally painful moments of the entire movie. Now, this is fantastic dialogue, but the truth is, Johnny didn't say that his father blamed him for this event per se, but Johnny's daughter Kathy did. In the book Johnny Cash the Biography, Kathy Cash said, "Grandpa always kind of blamed Dad for Jack's death, and Dad had this just real sad guilt thing about him his whole life." This is where I think the origins of this scene lie, and whether Ray did or didn't feel this way is a question that only he could have answered. But what is fact, though, is Johnny's relationship with his father would remain strained for a great deal of time, as you will see later on. We time travel here and skip over JR graduating from Dyess High School in 1950, where he had served as class vice president, and had mastered the art of the cool saying at a young age, apparently. Immediately following this, he went and enlisted in the U.S. Air Force, and this would be where he would adopt his new name, as the recruiters would not accept a candidate whose name was comprised of initials. So, in the moment, and forced to make a choice, he decided that for the next 4 years at least, JR would become John R. Cash. He would first be stationed at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas, and this is where he would meet his first wife, Vivian Liberto, at a local roller rink. The two would begin dating and fall madly in love, deciding quickly that they wanted to marry each other and live happily ever after.
3 weeks later,
Johnny received his deployment papers and was set to be shipped off to a base in Landsberg, West Germany. The base served as one of the forward outposts in the outbreak of the Cold War the U.S. found itself in against the Soviets after the end of World War II. This is where we pick back up in the movie where Johnny briefly comes home to visit after being deployed, and we get an extra scene of his sister asking about the name change to John.
Letters don't cut it in the Air Force, Reba. Told me to pick a name.
After he says his goodbyes to the rest of the family, Ray Cash takes full opportunity at another chance to be a prick.
Gonna be no battles, Gary. Going to Germany, the war's in Korea.
Which is really funny when you know about Ray's own war history in World War I, seeing as he never saw any real combat himself and was honorably discharged despite blowing a train guarding assignment. What do you have to say about that, Ray?
I'm gonna miss your bus.
Yeah.
Anyway, now we're off to Germany, and this is where the extended edition gives us some nice extra material. The regular edition has Johnny walk into a music shop and take a long look at a guitar, whereas in the extended edition, he lingers a bit longer and asks to take the guitar down, and we see just a little twinkle in his eyes as he holds it for the first time. Now, this is true as Johnny purchased his first guitar for about $5 in a music store in the small town of, Oberagamaro? Oberagamaro. Yeah, that's right. We also get a shot of him approaching the bass with his newly purchased guitar as we see a newspaper headline announcing the untimely death of country legend Hank Williams, who passed away suddenly from heart disease at the age of 29. I think that this originally was put in there as possible foreshadowing, since Johnny would go on to battle a lot of the same demons that ultimately assisted in Hank's death, and I think it belongs. Johnny's first real pursuits as a musician would come during his time in Germany, as he formed his first ever band, the Landsberg Barbarians, and although he had written some as a child, this is where his skills as a songwriter really began to blossom, as this would be where he would write his first version of his future hit, Folsom Prison Blues. He was inspired to write this song after seeing the movie Inside the Walls of Folsom Prison, like we see in the film. Johnny felt like he could relate to life in the clink because of the top-secret military position and its necessities on secrecy and seclusion. Speaking of that, another extra scene we get during this point in the movie is Johnny doing some work in his position as a Morse code operator, which is true. He rose to the rank of staff sergeant during his time in the security service unit, and due to his skill he showed in deciphering Morse code, he was put in a prominent seat at his Landsberg post to listen in on Soviet communications. This would have some nice unseen benefits later for his music career also, as his ability to pick out important rhythms and tones in sometimes garbled, busy, and concealed communications lent later in life to developing his unique sound. It would also lead to a super interesting fact about our man while researching. While manning his post on March 5, 1953, Johnny Cash became the very first American to hear the news of the death of Soviet Premier leader Joseph Stalin. Stalin had suffered a massive stroke just 4 days earlier, and his health status was of critical importance to the United States intelligence community and all Western powers. Of course, he couldn't tell anyone of his accomplishment until years later because of the secret nature of his job, and for most anyone else, this would have been the single biggest claim to fame that could be made. But since this is Johnny Cash, it is just a musical footnote in his legacy. I have to admit, though, I just love to think about the idea of what country music's future rebel icon relaying the news to the world of the death of one of history's most evil men might have sounded like.
And it appears time just finally ran out for the old cocksucker.
Anyway, this is also the moment in the movie where we get our first interaction between Johnny and Vivian. Now, we're going to address a giant elephant in the room early. It needs to be said that this is a very good depiction of the life of Johnny Cash, and while I will be filling in some gaps and pointing out a few missteps as we go through, a great majority of them either make sense as to why it was done the way it was, or they're fairly harmless. That being said, during my research I did find what I believe to be a massive inaccuracy in this film, and that is the portrayal of Johnny's first wife, Vivian Liberto, and the way their relationship is depicted. Now, I have my suspicions as to why this might have been, but nevertheless, she is shown throughout as a whiny, unsupportive nag who never believed in or really cared about Johnny and his musical career, the apparent complete antithesis of June Carter.
Your band? John, your band is two mechanics who can't hardly play.
Even from the very first time we see her having a conversation with Johnny, it is framed in a way that she has to be convinced to give a chance to this man who just wants to give her everything, and that her parents think something is wrong with, while she is hung up on the fact that they only dated for a few weeks and haven't even seen each other for a couple of years. And to be honest, even into the early stages of my research for this, the little bit I had read about her, I was beginning to have a similar opinion, and I thought for sure when I got into this review, I was going to be completely validated. However, as I started to dig deeper, I found nothing could be further from the truth. Vivian herself wrote a book called I Walked the Line, My Life with Johnny. Again, great name. And although it was released in 2007 after both Johnny and June had passed away, she tells the story of letting Johnny know of her intentions to write the book in the foreword, and of his total blessing to tell the whole truth. The thing is, after reading it, I believe her. And she comes with receipts because, to my surprise, I would say well over half of the 320-page book is love letters exchanged between her and Johnny during the 4 years he was in Germany. including one mentioning seeing the aforementioned inside Folsom Prison. It also gives not only a different perspective of things, but a heartbreaking inside look at what the consequences of stardom can do to a normal family. The children stand behind their mother's accounts as well. Their daughters Kathy and Roseanne hated the interpretation of their mother in the movie, and with Kathy in particular stating to news outlets back in 2005, "My mom was basically a non-entity in the entire film, except for the mad little psycho who hated his career. She loved his career and was proud of him until he started taking drugs and stopped coming home." So what this review is going to aim to do is to tell Vivian's truth as it pertains to the events of this film, and to hopefully give you a better account of the woman she was, as well as her and Johnny's love story. Johnny would be discharged in July of 1954, and Vivian would be waiting with the Cash family on the day he returned. The two would marry a month later to satisfy her parents' only condition of marriage approval, that they be together for at least 30 days after Johnny came home, to ensure that this was still what they both wanted. The couple would move to Memphis, and Johnny would take a job as an appliance salesman, but quickly learned selling things door to door is extremely difficult. Even more so when you're surrounded everywhere by your real passion, as we see in the movie, while he wanders through the streets of the blues capital of the world. It was also in Memphis where Johnny would meet Luther Perkins, Marshall Grant, and Red Kernodle, who were mechanics that had been working with Johnny's older brother Roy. The four began having some jam sessions after work and eventually decided to form a band, and it was Luther Perkins' playing style in particular that really came to define the band's sound. His guitar had not been well taken care of by the previous owner, and its volume and tone controls did not work. This resulted in him muting the 3 bass strings of the guitar with the heel of his right hand and scratching in a rhythmic pattern that produced the band's now signature boom chicka boom, or freight train sound. Luther and Marshall are depicted accurately personality-wise in the movie as well, with Marshall being the more gregarious and fun one, and Luther being the very straight-faced and serious one. Johnny would often remark on stage jokingly, "Luther's been dead for years and just doesn't know it." Now in the movie, we only meet Luther and Marshall, and that's because when it came time to audition for Sun Records, Red got too spun out by the stress of it all and he bailed mid-session. Speaking of the audition scene, that's where we go next, and like we see in the movie, it was Johnny's persistence that got him the tryout for Sam Phillips of Sun Records. Now, this was a pivotal moment for the band, as Sam Phillips was just beginning to make the ripples of the waves he would ultimately end up making in the music industry, having just signed Elvis Presley and Carl Perkins to his label. And if he liked their music, he could provide the exact same launching pad for them. This is also where we get the first images of Johnny in his now iconic all-black attire. The movie is correct in that this originated from the simple fact that the band wanted to match, and black was the only color shirt that all members owned. However, at this point, there really was no intention of making it a permanent thing, and there are plenty of early pictures of the group showing them wearing lighter colors. Johnny himself would often wear a white shirt with a sport coat in appearances and in photos. Sometimes he would even wear an entire suit of white. Album covers show him in stripes, plenty of blue denim, and even a gray shirt with a flower design. It wasn't until the late 60s and into the 70s, with the release of the hit song by the same name, that the Man in Black image and the meanings behind it that we will get into later, that it really became part of the mythos. Now, the scene itself is wonderful and is mostly correct to how it happened in real life, with just one real deviation. It's true that the band initially auditioned playing mostly gospel music and were rejected shortly into it by Sam Phillips pretty much for the reasons given.
We've already heard that song 100 times. Just like that, just like how you was singing it.
Now at this point in the movie, Johnny wins him over with his rendition of Folsom Prison Blues, but in real life, the song he banked his second chance was actually with Hey Porter. Sam saw potential in this one as he wanted something a little faster like what Elvis had been recently doing, but still wanted something a little different from Hey Porter as well. This led Johnny to go home and write Cry, Cry, Cry that night, which Phillips loved and made him decide to sign the band to this label in October of 1954. Now, I get why they changed that in the movie though, as Folsom is the more recognizable song and is a bigger deal to the movie. Cry, Cry, Cry does get some mention in the movie, however, especially in the extended edition, where we get scenes of Johnny writing the song in his basement, which of course Vivian hates because she interprets it to be about her, and also a scene where Johnny first hears it on the radio late one night in June of 1955. His excitement wakes up their daughter Roseanne, who had just been born about a month prior, and this upsets Vivian, even though the baby is totally fine.
I think she really likes it.
Because, if you haven't figured it out yet, Vivian is a bitch. Anyway, the coupled record of Hey Porter and Cry 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 had tremendous success, and it was due to this that the band would earn a spot on the Louisiana Hayride Tour with Elvis and began traveling across the southern United States in the late summer and fall of 1955. Vivian tells a story in her book about Johnny's first night opening for the King on August 5th of 1955 at the Overton Park Shell in Memphis, an outdoor amphitheater just minutes from their home. Just as Johnny had come on stage and was about to sing, the stage spotlight went dark and the sound system went dead. For a moment, he stood there in the dark as there was an uncomfortable hush in the amphitheater. And for most other brand new artists, something like this would have likely led to a disastrous onstage meltdown. But Johnny Cash, cool as a cucumber and quick on his toes, jokingly asked the audience, "Does anybody have a deck of cards?" That was just the icebreaker needed as everybody laughed and relaxed. The microphone was fixed within a few minutes and the show went on without any further hitches. This was also the same time period Johnny would record the first version of Folsom Prison Blues, but it would not come out until December of '55. Like most other songs recorded during the early Sun Records sessions, the band had no drummer, and so Johnny replicated the snare drum sounds by inserting a piece of paper under the guitar strings and strumming the snare rhythm on his guitar. Another little interesting tidbit I found out about it is that, let's just say he borrowed a lot of what would be this song. He took the melody for the song and many of the lyrics from Gordon Jenkins's 1953 concept album Seven Dreams, specifically the song Crescent City Blues. Jenkins was not credited, and once the song had become immensely popular, he came looking for his slice and ended up taking home a settlement of approximately $75,000 following a lawsuit. Anyway, both editions of the movie pick back up with Johnny on the road in Texarkana in 1955, and this is the moment where Johnny meets June Carter for the first time backstage. The movie jumps the gun a bit, however, as Johnny didn't actually meet his future missus until the following year in July of 1956. He would also not meet her in Texarkana, but rather backstage at the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville after making his first performance there. Unfortunately, I also have to be the one to break it to you that their initial meeting was not the meet cute that we get in the movie where June gets tangled in Johnny's guitar strap. In real life, the first meeting between the two was a little less dramatic, as June herself has told the events. Johnny shyly remarked, "I've always wanted to meet you," as he had been a massive fan of the Carter family, and June in particular, since listening to the group on the radio as a little boy, like we see earlier in the film. June reportedly responded, "I feel like we already know each other," and apart from that, June claims she remembered nothing else about this first meeting except his eyes. I suppose the guitar strap thing tale is a bit more fun though. We also get an extra scene in the extended edition during this show of Johnny briefly being introduced to June's parents, Ezra and Mother Maybelle Carter. Now, as we pointed out before, this likely didn't happen until much later, but I imagine when it did, this was a very big deal to Johnny. Mother Maybelle Carter was a folk music legend at this point, having already been a part of the wildly successful original Carter family before then forming a singing group with her daughters. The Carters' music bridged the gap between traditional Appalachian folk music and new hillbilly music, which would evolve into what we know as country music. She also pioneered what would be one of the most copied styles of playing guitar across all forms of music, called the Carter Scratch. In this style, a person can play both lead and rhythm on a guitar, and she is credited with transforming the instrument from background rhythm to the dominant lead sound in pop culture. For her contribution to country music, Maybelle was the first woman inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. Like she mentions a bit later during the dinner scene, while performing with her mother and sisters, June had to work extra hard to get noticed, as it was generally understood that her sister Anita was the more talented singer. However, June was no slouch herself, and her biggest asset was that she knew how to work a crowd. Using what she had learned, June started imbuing her performances with comedy, unafraid to be the butt of the joke, similar to what we see during the guitar strap scene. Her clownish routines would extend into physical comedy, and her recurring Aunt Polly character was a huge hit with the audiences. As someone who knows a thing or two about the strategy of playing the fool to trying to gain acceptance, I get it. This part of the movie gives us a small nod to another interesting thing I found during research. There's a snippet of Johnny catching June arguing off stage with Elvis, which got me wondering.
What's up? I say what's up? What is up with that? What is up with that? What is up with that?
As it turns out, Johnny and June's son, John Carter Cash, insists that he believes at this point in her life June was likely having an affair on her first husband Carl Smith with the King. He also states that after Carl moved out, that Elvis would stay there sometimes to crash and recover while on tour.
I'm very aroused.
Although June always denied it, her son says that a mischievous twinkle would always come across her eye when Elvis would get brought up. It's possible this scene is a hint of that.
I'd like to think so.
Anyhow, in real life, things were starting to really take off for Johnny, both personally and professionally. He and Vivian welcomed their second daughter, Kathy, to the world in April of 1956, and a month later, Johnny would release what would be possibly his most notable song of all time, I Walk the Line. Now, this is one of the other big things that the movie gets wrong as far as the timing and the inspiration behind the song. It shows Johnny not releasing it until 2 years later in 1958 after June gets mad at him and runs off stage for goading her into singing Time's A-Wasting, a song that was made famous originally by her and her ex-husband, and then he plants one on her cheek. Johnny then goes on a bender, discovers his lover destroying shit, and June teases him and the boys the next day when it becomes clear that
you can't walk no line,
which motivates him to write the song. In reality, I found no evidence of the Time's A-Wasting fight, and the real inspiration behind the song, as Johnny states, I wrote the song backstage one night in 1956 in Gladewater, Texas. I was newly married at the time, and I suppose I was laying out my pledge of devotion. This coincides very much with the scene of Vivian reading fan mail and getting sketched out by all of the newfound attention her husband was getting. This was Johnny's proclamation to his wife, as he originally intended the song to be a slow ballad, but producer Sam Phillips preferred a faster arrangement, and in the end, Johnny agreed to the change. After writing the song, he ran it by fellow performer Carl Perkins, who encouraged him to adopt the I Walk the Line as the song title. The song would become a smash hit, quickly selling 1 million records and nabbing Johnny his first #1 on the Billboard charts. Johnny began touring all across the country with the likes of Elvis, Carl Perkins, and the other two big acts that had just recently signed with Sun Records, Roy Orbison and Jerry Lee Lewis. Can you just imagine being one of the people who got to see that show? This was also the year of the famed $1 Million Quartet session, which I'm kinda surprised is not even an extra scene in the movie. On December 4th, Elvis dropped in on Carl Perkins recording a new song with Jerry Lee backing on piano. Johnny happened to be there at the studio too, and this led to the most infamous impromptu jam session of all time. Several songs from this would end up seeing the light of day over the years, and it is also the subject of a stage musical by the same name. We don't see it in the movie at all, but Vivian and their daughters would accompany Johnny on the tour in these early years. But as the tours began taking longer and longer, and taking them further and further away from home, eventually it grew to a point where Vivian and the kids had to start staying behind at home. These long trips were also becoming more physically demanding, as we see during the touring caravan scenes. This combination of factors would see Johnny's vices start to creep out: the groupies, the drugs, and the June Carter. We see him attempt to kiss her for the first time during this part, and as far as I can tell, any romantic side of their relationship did not actually start up this early. They would be brought together by various big shows over the next few years, but she was not on the touring caravan at this point, so we will address this more later. After this, though, is where we see Johnny taking his first pills after they're endorsed by Elvis. Johnny had struggled a bit with drinking during his days in the service, but it is at this point in time that he began taking amphetamines as a means to keep up with the rigors of touring life. The long drives and need to maintain a certain energy level and vigor for performances led many musicians of the day to experiment with uppers, and Johnny was no exception. He would eventually chase this dragon into some serious lows, but at first this was just a way to keep pace with the legend he was forging. As it turns out, Johnny couldn't walk no line also when it came to the other temptations of attaining the status of a bad boy superstar.
Wild women, the wild women, the rippin' and the tearin', the rippin' and the tearin'.
Johnny has gone on record of admitting to cheating on Vivian several times with groupies during this stage of his career, and we see some snippets of this in the movie. It's unfortunate, but it's pretty par for the course, as I would imagine everyone on that tour was probably slaying nightly.
That boy Elvis sure likes to talk poon.
But, you know, he only did it because Vivian was being such a naggy bitch, am I right? Another funny little thing that turned out to be true was that Jerry Lee really was convinced that they were going to hell because of the music they sang.
God gave us a great big apple seed, and he said, don't touch it. Don't think about touching it. Don't sing about touching it. Don't think about singing about touching it.
You can't touch this.
Jerry Lee had been from a devout Louisiana Christian home and had actually been kicked out of Bible college for doing a boogie-woogie rendition of a gospel song for a talent show. As long as there is music, there will always be forms of it that some people consider unholy, and the relatively new sounds of rockabilly and eventually rock and roll were the ones of the day. If only they could have seen what the next several decades would hold. But this was a different time, as we are reminded in the movie.
Divorce is an abomination. Marriage, it's a life.
When Jerry Lee made the comment one night about their fiery future destination, Johnny reportedly simply responded with, "Maybe you're right, killer. Maybe you are right." Anyway, Johnny started showing up everywhere over the next 2 years, making his first appearances at the aforementioned Grand Ole Opry, Jackie Gleason, Ed Sullivan, Dick Clark, Country Music Jubilee, and many more. This helped propel his first album, With His Hot and Blue Guitar, which he released on October 11, 1957, to tremendous success. However, there was a bit of tension brewing at Sun Records, as Sam Phillips still did not want Johnny to record any gospel. He was also only paying Johnny 3% royalty rather than the standard 5%. Elvis had already left the label, and despite Johnny being the most consistent artist for him commercially, Sam had already shifted most of his focus to Jerry Lee Lewis. At this point, Johnny had become one of the biggest country artists in the world in a short amount of time, and it would not be long before major labels like Columbia Records came calling. They would throw Johnny a very lucrative offer, including a reported signing bonus of $50,000, which was a truckload of money back then. And in July 1958, he would officially sign with the label. And just like that, the Cash family packed up and headed to California. All of this is captured during the Walk the Line montage as we fast forward some years ahead. These years contain some key moments though that I will try and recap for you quickly. In 1958, he played his first performance at a prison when he appeared at San Quentin Penitentiary. By this time, he was already receiving letters from inmates that had heard Folsom Prison Blues and had adopted it as their anthem, and Johnny as one of their own. Performing for inmates would go on to become a big interest for Johnny later on down the line, as the really famous concerts are still to come. However, it's worth noting that this performance is the first time he opened with his now signature,
"Hello, I'm Johnny Cash."
The inmates ate it up and gave him a standing ovation, and this became the way he would open every show from here on out. This is also where the backing band of the Tennessee 2 officially became the Tennessee 3, with the addition of drummer W.S. Holland in 1960. The movie subtly shows us this a bit earlier during one of the musical numbers. Speaking of that, musically Johnny still was doing well. He had recorded a gospel album for Columbia, but was in a weird position because Sam Phillips and Sun Records still owned a backlog of a lot of his material. They would continue releasing it as late as 1964, some of it being very successful, and creating what I'm sure was not a fun position to be in. Shortly before signing with Columbia and heading to California, Johnny also switched agents to promoter Stu Carnall, whom had helped him book some of his first California concerts. Vivian recounts in her book of how Stu was a very pleasant guy, but that he really loved the LA party life and burning it at both ends. Johnny was already hooked on uppers and downers at this point, but Vivian believes that it was Stu's influence that played a small role in helping the snowball to roll faster, so to speak, as Johnny began indulging more in the same lifestyle. This is also when Johnny would first dip his toe into crossing over into acting, as he appeared in his first movie, 5 Minutes to Live, in 1961. The response was not good. The Cash family was also growing as well. Johnny and Vivian welcomed daughters number 3 and 4 with the addition of Cindy in 1959 and Tara in 1961. They would also find themselves on the move again as well in 1961, buying a new house in Casita Springs, California, and hoping to get a fresh start a bit further away from Hollywood shadow. It's here where the wheels of the freight train would really begin to derail, however. As Johnny stood on the precipice of immortality, his struggles with addiction were seemingly threatened to snuff out the story prematurely, like several others before him. Balancing his stardom and his life as a family man was becoming harder and harder, especially when his real vice was just now becoming a part of his daily life, as June Carter would officially join the tour in 1962. All of these things heading to crescendo would see Johnny's life get much more turbulent in the coming years as he spiraled towards rock bottom. But we will cover that when we come back for part 2 of our Walk the Line review. Be on the lookout for that in about a week or so. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. Until I see you next time.
Good night. And always remember, that's...